In the Gokturk documentary, we saw how the Asheena family appeared seemingly out of nowhere in the Altai Mountains around the year 400, and from there liberated the Turk people from bondage. Subsequently, the Bumin and Istemi brothers assumed ruler titles, gathered all Turkic tribes and federations, and in the process established the first Eurasian steppe empire in history. Now, I have always spoken of the Turks when I have told you the events in the Gokturk Khaganate. However, this does not at all mean that only Turks lived in the Gök-Türk Empire. Moreover, the Turks had been scattered all over Eurasia before the arrival of the Asheena. The Khaganate formed only the loose confederation of all these Turkic peoples. The question arises, which Turkic peoples actually existed at that time? Which ethnic groups still lived in the empire? And how was the interaction between all these ethnic groups? Let's find out. This map shows the empire of the Gokturks in the 580s. During that time period, the Khaganate was engulfed in civil war. Here we can see, on the one hand, the territory of the ruler in the west, in this case it's Tardis, and the territory of the ruler in the east, at that time it was Ishbara. The border ran more or less vertically down from the Orkhon Valley. The capital of the east, Otukon, was quite close to this border. In addition, all the Magyar ethnic groups in the empire are marked. But what tribes actually lived within the Khaganate? There were 4 politically and socio-culturally relevant groups in that area. First, the Khitan. They are a non-Turkic collection of Proto-Mongol tribes. The Khitan are first mentioned in the chronology of the Western Wei dynasty in northern China. It is likely that the Khitan were once part of the Turco-Mongol Xianbei Federation, and split off after its fall. According to Chinese records, the Khitan regularly shaved their heads, and instead grew hair from the temple along the neck region to chest height. In any case, the Khitan were successfully conquered by the Gokturks after Mukhan attacked from the west, and in time the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo attacked from the east. The Khitan then forcibly settled on the Yellow Sea. These Para-Mongols had only 43,000 warriors around the year 600, which would be a fraction of the Gokturk army. However, they later played an important role in the Turkic-Chinese power struggle. The best known of the Turkic ethnic groups in this area is the tribal federation of the Nine Ogas, in Turkish Dokuz Ogas. Ogas translates simply as tribe or community. This collection had once been part of the Turkic Teal Federation. The Teal, as we saw in the documentary, ruled one from the Altai Mountains to Kazakhstan. However, they were more of a loose collection of tribes than a centralized empire. The Nine Ogas eventually split off from them and settled in Northeast Asia. They played an important role for the Gokturks. On the one hand, they fought many wars against the Chinese in the name of the Khagan, and on the other hand, they themselves were involved in revolts against the rule of their liege. In the Orkhon inscriptions, for example, it is said that Bilge Khagan, the most famous of all Gokturk rulers, considered the Nine Ogas as his people. But when the world became unbalanced, the Nine Ogas turned against Bilge and rebelled. The history of the Nine Ogas is very interesting and to some extent obscure. There are theories that some of the Nine Ogas are descended from the Koreans or the Tungus. In any case, we will talk about them in the second, and especially third Gokturk movies. The Kyrgyz lived at that time on the Yenisei River, near Lake Baikal, and were one of the oldest Turkic peoples. Their stay in this region is documented from the 3rd century BC to the 13th century AD. According to Peter B. Golden's analysis, their name is derived from the Old Turkic term for gray horses. Chinese sources claim that the earliest Kyrgyz descended from the Sayan Mountains. Their appearance is described in many sources as Asian, but with blonde or reddish hair. But the linguistic evidence suggests that the Kyrgyz were not immigrants from Europe, but an original people from Siberia, so they were part of the so-called Paleo-Siberian peoples. Possibly, they were Turkified later, but before the arrival of the Gokturks. During the time of the Gokturks, they were subjugated by Mukhan Khagan in 560. However, they played a significant role within the Khaganate. After the end of the Second Gök-Türk Empire in the 8th century, the Uyghurs had taken over their role as lords of the steppe, but about a century later the Kyrgyz disputed the Uyghurs' rule. They formed their own Khaganate, which was more aligned with the state model of the Gokturks than with that of the partly Sinikized Uyghurs. And this despite the fact that the Kyrgyz Khagans, who incidentally used the ancient Turkic script of the Gokturks, always presented themselves as descendants of a certain Li Guang. Li was an important Chinese genera of the Chinese Han dynasty. Just as the Nine Ogas, the Kyrgyz will play an important role later on. Seer Tardis is a reconstruction of the original name for the Xuyentua, an ethnic group that, like the Dokas Ogas, was also once part of the Teal. Their history does not really pick up until the 7th century. However, their prehistory may provide a clue to the ancient Turks' kinship with the Huns. In the Tongdian book, a Chinese encyclopedia of 756, the Seer Tardis are described as an amalgamation of two distinct tribes, the Shui and the Yentua. The Yentua were once subjugated by the Huns, and after the fall of the Han Empire, they merged with the Shui, hence the name Xuyentua. In 605, an incident occurred when the Western Turkic Khagan, Arslan Taman, attacked the Xuyentua in the east, presumably to dispute them with the Eastern Turks and subjugate them. As a result, they established their own empire under the leadership of the Chibi tribe, which was based in the Turfan Basin. Over 100 years later, after the demise of the Gokturks, the Seer Tardis rose to become a powerful player and, temporarily, took the Turks' place on the geopolitical chessboard of Asia. In the east of the empire, the composition of society looks quite a bit more exciting. We have already discussed the Teal. Here we are dealing with those Teal tribes that had not split off from the core and were called Tolos in the Turkic Orkhon writings. They had settled at Lake Balchash and were notorious for their numerous rebellions against the Asheena dynasty. Despite their rebelliousness, the Teal were an essential part of the military might of the Gokturks, cause it was they who, under the command of Istemi, had expanded the empire from the Altai to the Caucasus. In this sense, the light blue territory over which Tardis, son of Istemi, ruled, corresponds to the conquests of the Teal. Whether Tardis was grateful to them for this? Further west we find the Khaimek. As with the Teal, the Khaimek are not one tribe, but a whole federation of tribes that resided on the Irtish River. Where do they come from? Vladimir Minersky, with the help of Barthold's research, theorized that Khaimek would consist of the Turkic Iki Imek, meaning the two Imek. The founding tribes were probably called Imi and Imek. On the other hand, Pritsak claimed that the Khaimek had a connection with the Proto-Mongol Kumo, but this is rejected by other scholars such as Golden. The famous Turkic scholar Mahmud al-Kashgari, who once wrote a book about all Turkic peoples in the 11th century, equated the Khaimek with the Kipchaks, who ruled Ukraine at that time. Like the Seer Tardis in the east, the Khaimek in the west established their own empire after the demise of the Gokturks. The Persian scholar Abu Said Gardizi wrote at the same time as al-Kashgari that certain tribes such as the Bayandar and Imer were part of this federation. In the very west of the Khaganate, we find three ethnic groups that will be familiar to you. The Magyars, the original people of the Huns, probably lived in the 6th and 7th centuries on the Volga River. The Bulgarians lived further south at the Lake Azov. Both ethnic groups migrated to Europe after the fall of the Gokturks and established important European kingdoms. Incidentally, they retained their belief in Tingri for quite a while before they were Christianized. Further south lived the Khazars, or rather the ancestors of the Khazars. This is still not clear. Tong Yabgu, the king of the Western Turks, laid the foundation in 630 for the later founding of the Khazar Empire, a county that would dominate the Caucasus and all surrounding areas for centuries, and whose political leadership would convert to Judaism. Lastly, we find two ethnic groups that are the most important, the Ogas and the Sogdians. We have already reported in detail about the Sogdians in the first movie. They had a very good, probably even intimate relationship with the Asheena dynasty, and were well integrated into the Gök-Türk Empire, in contrast to the Teal. However, we did not mention the Ogas in the movie. Now we have arrived at the most important ethnic group of that time. They are not the Dokas Ogas, as they had no relationship to each other despite the similar names. Although Ogas stands for tribe in Turkish, this is also a Turkic federation, and perhaps the most important of all. For they are the ones who laid the foundation for today's Turkey. The Ogas Yabgu Federation produced 24 tribes, including the Bayandыр, who must have been part of the Khaimek prior, the Kei, and the Kinnik. The Besinek were also part of it. Why are these tribes so important? The Kinnik were the tribe of the later Seljuks, whose conquests, on the one hand, stirred up political conditions in the Middle East, triggering the Crusades. On the other hand, with the Seljuks, many Ogas tribes also moved out of the Caspian Sea area and migrated to Iran, then as far as Iraq and Syria, and finally to Anatolia. Two of these tribes were the Bayandыр and Kei. A man named Bayandыр Khan is referred to in the book Dede Korkut as the ruler of the Ogas. But that legend was written at the court of the Aq Koyunlu, who in turn traced their family history back to the Bayandыр, as we have seen in the respective video about the Aq Koyunlu history. Accordingly, it can be assumed that each of the 24 Ogas tribes provided a ruler in turn. The Bayandыр established a small duchy in eastern Anatolia in the 13th century and conquered large parts of Persia and Iraq in the 15th century. At the same time, the Ottomans had established themselves as a major power in western Anatolia and the Balkans. And the tribe on which the Ottomans based themselves was the Kei tribe. Thus, 500 years ago, two Turkish dynasties faced each other, whose ancestors had been part of the Ogas Federation. In Eastern Europe, moreover, the Pechenegs had established themselves as a serious semi-nomadic great power in the 11th century and had permanently tangled with the Byzantines. There are many legends and myths about the Ogas. But if you leave all that aside and look only at the facts, you can rightly say that the Ogas Yabgu Federation was the most important state in Turkish history. Without it, the Ottomans, the Aq Koyunlu, and the Seljuks would never have existed. And without it, the Turks would not have emigrated to Anatolia. Today's Turkey would probably not exist in the way it does, with Turkish being the dominant culture. However, as important as the Ogas later became, their role in the Gök-Türk Empire is obscure. We know only that they settled in the area of Lake Zitusu in present-day Kazakhstan, and were not part of the Teal or other federations. Their society was also militaristic, for the nomadic lifestyle had necessarily raised them to be hunters, and thus warriors. In time, they settled down. Mahmud al-Kashgari lists the cities of Sabran, Karnak, and Sudnak for them. In fact, the Ogas settled down over time, and their so-called Ogas Yabgu Federation became an important player against the invading Arabs from the Orient. But we have already seen that in the video about the origin of the Ottomans by now. This was the overview of the more important ethnic groups in the empire of the Gokturks. As we have seen, most of them were Turkic. However, each ethnic group, if we may say so, had its own cultural and even linguistic characteristics. Accordingly, unity in the empire was not maintained at all times. Often, the rulers of the Asheena dynasty had to go out and fight in order to put down rebellions. Nevertheless, it was significant for further Turkic history that under the Asheena banner, for the first time ever, all Turkic peoples lived in one state.